The Cowboys are acquiring wide receiver George Pickens from the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers will reportedly be receiving draft compensation, including a third-rounder and some other pick swaps.
The move squarely puts the Cowboys as a playoff contending football team this coming season. I anticipate the Cowboys to be better than other people.
It's very rare for us to see a huge blockbuster trade go down all the way in May. I mean, typically by this point, all the major trades have been made. They're either made in March or right when the NFL draft is going down. The only major decision we're waiting on for at this point is for Aaron Rodgers to come out and tell us that he signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, originally, the Pittsburgh Steelers were seen as a slam dunk location for Rodgers, primarily because this is a team that has a suffocating defense and they have an incredible wide receiver core. I mean, Aaron Rodgers would have the ability to throw the football to DK Metcalf, who the Steelers acquired in a trade earlier, George Pickens, and Pat Freiermuth. But it seems like that wide receiver room is going to get a little bit thinner, and it's probably in the funniest way possible. This past year, in week 5 of the NFL season, the Pittsburgh Steelers faced off against the Dallas Cowboys in a game that the Dallas Cowboys would win 20-17, but that game wasn't without its drama. There was a tremendous amount of controversy. George Pickens ran a career-low 20 routes, and during those 20 routes, well, he didn't really have the best attitude, and he would end up getting benched against the Dallas Cowboys of all teams. There's multiple clips of him running half speed on all of his routes against the Cowboys. This pissed off Mike Tomlin and eventually resulted in George Pickens getting benched for a large majority of the games. At the time, we didn't know if this was George Pickens protesting to have Justin Fields benched in favor for Russell Wilson, or if he was just frustrated at how inaccurate Justin Fields was. And on the most crucial down of the game, he didn't even attempt to run a route, and this was really shocking because the Steelers were only down by 3 points in this game. Now, the interesting part would occur at the end of the game where George Pickens would throw Jordan Lewis to the side as he was celebrating the Dallas Cowboys victory. Following the game, Jordan Lewis would say this about George Pickens. And things would get even more bizarre. Mike Tomlin would say this about Pickens.
We just wanted to kind of minimize his reps in an effort to get more productivity. You know, we just trying to rep manage in terms of the totality of the big picture. He wasn't less of a focal point in terms of our intentions of what we wanted to do offensively, but we did want to cut his reps a little bit in an effort to get higher quality play. Just in general.
George Pickens would make himself unavailable for interviews, and probably the craziest part of all is Jordan Lewis would leave to the Jacksonville Jaguars in the offseason, whereas the Dallas Cowboys would actually trade for George Pickens. And this is where it gets pretty funny because, according to Adam Schefter, the Dallas Cowboys and Pittsburgh Steelers are working to finalize a trade that will send wide receiver George Pickens to the Cowboys in exchange for draft pick compensation. The trade is expected to be finalized today. And then if you go back, you can see Jordan Lewis quote tweeting this and saying, "Confirmation God wanted me in Jacksonville." This was initially seen as surprising because going into the offseason, the Steelers needed a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2, depending on how you view George Pickens. And it seems like once again, as a result of a trade with the Cowboys, they are back where they started. They need a wide receiver 2 once again. And this is a very interesting trade because the Cowboys gave up a lot for George Pickens if you consider the circumstances. So the Cowboys are sending a 2026 third round pick and a 2027 fifth round pick to the Steelers for George Pickens and a 2027 sixth round pick. You might think I'm exaggerating when I say that the Cowboys gave up a lot for George Pickens. When you consider the circumstances, this is a crazy amount to give up for a wide receiver that's on the final season of his contract. And originally, if you took a look at what was going on with the Steelers and George Pickens, the writing was kind of on the wall. I mean, when Pickens was asked at the end of the season if he's seeing signs of growth from the Steelers offense, this is what he had to say.
Have you seen signs of growth, and how much more does this team still need to grow offensively?
Yeah, I've seen signs of growth for sure. From past, the first year I've been here, just way more growth for sure.
Does that make you optimistic going forward?
Nah.
Now, on one hand, George Pickens has always had this reputation of maybe being uncoachable or very difficult to deal with in the locker room. And there have been instances where he has been outspoken with the media.
You're not going to win a game when you got to let the refs in. Buffalo Bills.
But at the same time, according to Peter Schrager, it seems like George Pickens never really had an issue with the Pittsburgh Steelers in the locker room and isn't uncoachable. That's just a narrative surrounding him.
I talked to the Steelers folks. George Pickens is demonstrative on the field, but he is not an uncoachable player. In fact, he does have a great way about him in the locker room and is very well liked in Pittsburgh.
In order to truly evaluate this trade, we have to understand that there's multiple levels to this trade that make this trade what it is. On one hand, George Pickens is an incredibly talented wide receiver, a wide receiver that is without a doubt more than capable of being the wide receiver one on many football teams. I mean, if you just take a look at his statistics, this is a receiver that went over 1,000 yards receiving in 2023 with Kenny Pickett as his starting QB and almost had 1,000 yards receiving despite only playing in 14 games this past year. According to Dan Orlovsky, George Pickens averages 16.3 yards per reception for his career, and that ranks first among 44 players with 2,000 receiving yards across the last 3 seasons. This is over the likes of AJ Brown and Brandon Ayuk. It seems like CeeDee Lamb may have known that something was going on because he posted this on X before the trade was announced. And if you just take a look at George Pickens and CeeDee Lamb's measurables, I mean, having these two next to each other is going to be absolutely terrifying. I mean, just take a look at this. I mean, they're both practically the same height, the same weight. They're practically as fast as each other, have the same vert, the same arm length. So from that perspective, if you're a Cowboys fan, you have to be very excited. But at the same time, you have to look at the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers trading their top wide receivers away. And it's actually a pretty scary history. I mean, in 2019, they traded Antonio Brown to the Oakland Raiders. Brown would sign an extension with the Raiders, cause a circus during the preseason, and wouldn't even make it to the regular season. The Steelers would trade Chase Claypool in 2023 to the Chicago Bears for a second-round pick. And for those of you guys that don't know how that turned out, we have a completely separate video on it, but Claypool would pretty much only play in 10 games for the Chicago Bears, would only have 18 receptions for 191 receiving yards for the Bears before getting traded to Miami and then finding his way out of the league. To this day, Chase Claypool still doesn't have a job, and we have a separate video on that, and I'll leave it in the end screen for you guys to check it out. The only wide receiver that I'd say ended up doing fine once he left the Pittsburgh Steelers is Juju Smith-Schuster, but Juju actually had the ceiling of potentially being good enough to be the wide receiver one for the Steelers. Now he's more of a complimentary wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he found great success doing that. But then more recently, the one receiver that we don't talk about nearly as much on this channel is probably the most disastrous wide receiver out of any recent Pittsburgh Steelers receiver that has been traded away from the team. Last year, the Steelers traded Deontay Johnson to the Carolina Panthers for Dante Jackson and the 178th overall pick in the 2024 NFL Draft. Deontay Johnson would play 7 games with the Carolina Panthers, would have 3 touchdowns and 30 receptions before the Panthers decided to trade Deontay Johnson to the Baltimore Ravens for a 2025 5th-round pick. And at the time, I said this wasn't necessarily the greatest trade for the Panthers and they just should have kept Deontay Johnson because they needed all the help they could get. But boy, was I wrong. Just 2 months later, he'd get cut by the Baltimore Ravens, claimed by the Houston Texans. 2 weeks later, he would leave the Houston Texans and go back to the Baltimore Ravens. And then just a week ago, the Cleveland Browns signed him to a 1-year, $1.17 million contract. So a truly disastrous year for Deontay Johnson, and the point being that the Pittsburgh Steelers don't typically lose whenever they trade their wide receiver away. And I'd say that's my concern. But another concern I have isn't anything to do with George Pickens' talent. I think he actually could be really cool in the locker room, and if there's a good culture around him, this could really help out the Dallas Cowboys. But at the same time, this is another high-end talent that is on a contract year that we gave up a 3rd-round pick for. And it's not like the Cowboys historically have done a good job signing their talent to contract extensions. As a matter of fact, I'd say it's the one thing that the Jones family is terrible at doing. 1 year into his contract extension, and Dak Prescott is still the highest paid wide receiver in the NFL. CeeDee Lamb is the 3rd highest paid wide receiver in the NFL, and Micah Parsons is up for a contract extension, which, by the way, shares the same exact agent as George Pickens. But apparently, Jerry Jones didn't know that? Yeah, according to Adam Schefter, soon-to-be Cowboys wide receiver George Pickens is heading into the last year of his contract and will want a new deal. His agent appears to be David Mulugheta, whose name Cowboys owner Jerry Jones said he did not know while talking about a new deal for Micah Parsons, another client of David Mulugheta. I don't necessarily know if this is going to turn into a Jamar Chase T. Higgins situation. For those of you guys that don't remember, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins were both signed to contract extensions together and were both represented by the same exact agent. T. Higgins ended up getting $28.75 million a year, whereas Jamar Chase ended up getting $40.25 million a year, which is insane for a wide receiver, by the way. So it's really difficult to grade the trade because this is a very risky trade that could very well pay off for the Cowboys and fills a huge position of need. But at the same time, if the Cowboys lose George Pickens after this year, you pretty much gave up a third-round pick for absolutely nothing. From the Pittsburgh Steelers' perspective, it seems like if you're ready to move on from George Pickens, if you don't want to sign him to a contract extension, getting a third-round pick in return for him is pretty sweet in my opinion. But this is one of those trades that don't have a clear winner or loser from the moment that the trade happens. The Cowboys are taking a huge risk on George Pickens, not only on whether or not he'd fit into their offense, but whether or not they could retain him past this year, given the fact that they actually have other players that they need to sign. The Pittsburgh Steelers have a history of doing this and making out like bandits each and every time. At the end of the day, the one thing I could say for sure as a Cowboy fan is this certainly is an exciting trade to make. It certainly makes Dak Prescott's life a hell of a lot easier, and it concludes a pretty good offseason for the Cowboys, where they made sneaky small free agent acquisitions that didn't necessarily steal headlines, but all filled positions of need. And personally, I'm a huge fan of those types of off seasons. This is easily their splashiest acquisition. So let me know in the comment section down below if you're a Cowboy fan. What do you guys think about this trade? Grade the trade for me in the comment section down below. Aside from that, I don't know if you heard, but Justin Tucker just got kicked out of the NFL. We have a completely separate video on that, and I'm going to leave it in the end screen to meet you guys there. I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.